I'm Jessica Ransom, the Director of Artist Services at the Cultural Council. I am here to introduce today our art panel. Our visiting curator, Juliana Forero, is an independent art professional and founder and director of Nomad Art Projects, who has developed exhibitions for Bailey Contemporary Arts, Arts Warehouse, Del Rey, and Pompano Beach Cultural Center, among others. In her role as chief curator for the city of Pembroke Pines, she curates exhibitions for the Franck Art Gallery and Studio 18 Art Complex. A native of Columbia, Ferrero worked as the director of education for Houston Center for Photography prior to relocating to South Florida. Her doctoral dissertation researched the role of the artistic community in the revitalization of the South Bronx while working in the development department of the Bronx Museum of the Arts. And we also have three artists who I'm going to let Juliana introduce to you: Missy Pierce, Dana Donahue, and Izel Vargas. So take it away, Juliana.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. Quick question: how do the slides get moved? Not that we need to now, but like, how do we get to the next?
The next one here.
But we don't need to do it now.
I'll get you the
great.
clicker.
So, well, thank you everybody. It's been great to put this exhibition together and to have the opportunity, besides the tour and the opening reception, to have an opportunity to dig deeper. Oh, thank you. About the meaning of this exhibition. So I want us to kind of imagine this conversation as if we were just having in a living room, having chocolatico con queso. So to me, that's kind of like the setting that I want to set for us for this conversation. I ask each artist to send me some images so that we can set the tone of what their practice is. But this is gonna go as soon as we start the conversation. I wanna say I have had different conversations with each one of them, and I've met them in different opportunities. Missy, I think I met you, it was like 6 years ago. She was a resident in Bailey Contemporary Arts, where I work in Pompano, and we had conversations in passing about her artwork, and identity was always there. Dana, I met in this exhibition, but we have some really hot, amazing emails back and forth about what this exhibition means and what it means to be Latino, Hispanic, and beyond. And then with Izel, it's been a while. We worked together like in 2 or 3 shows in the past 4 or 5 years, and also in Pembroke Pines. So for me, because of our different backgrounds, I thought that it would be fantastic for us to have this conversation. So I will allow them to introduce themselves. All of them are artists from Palm Beach, so I will leave it at that. So we can start with Dana, and you can point at some of the images that you have in there.
Right, so I'm an interdisciplinary artist. I work in sculpture, painting, drawing, and installation. Let me refer to my notes. So my work responds to some of life's most vexing problems. There are conversations that happen in my work, and certainly cultural identity is one of those issues that comes up. The work is a satirical examination of societal constructs through the lens of humor. And we've got the work that we're looking at here, and then I have a painting in the other room, and I'll just briefly mention the painting in the other room. That what I'm thinking about in that work is the balance and imbalance and freedom through the use of color and scale. There's usually a human figure which is disproportionate to the scale of the creatures, which is a little exploration about what it means to have freedom. And in the work that's behind me, this is a continuation of that work, but I've expanded that conversation to include asymmetric cultural hybridity, misogyny, and consumerism. And for the purpose of the conversation, I'll point out some elements that are in the work that really deal with cultural identity. Up here on the left, I'm using objects as visual cues in the work to talk about the way that my culture was often presented to me, which was in fragments. So we have that spoon and some books and other objects which are all responding to that. And that's it.
Great. Thank you and welcome. So now we're going to listen to from Missy Pierce.
See, those aren't mine. No, I'm just
That would be good.
My heart jumped for
I have some similar interests that Dana just talked about, and the main one, the reason I think I'm here is because of my hybrid identity as well. I grew up between two cultures. I was raised in a small southwestern desert town run by quiet Mormons, Betty Crocker, and all the sticker bushes, everything you can imagine. And then in the summer, we would go to the jungle of South America in Colombia, where my mom was from. So I was so confused because there everything was loud, there was lots of color, there was a heavy Afro-Caribbean influence. There was always so much going on, a lot of touching and hugging and besitos and all that. And then we'd go back to this quiet little town in the shadow of the nuclear test site, by the way. And it was just such a contrast between the two. I didn't really know who I was. So my approach to that split identity was to assimilate as much as I could into my homogenous desert town being, so much so that when I was old enough, I changed my Spanish name. I was actually born Norma Elvira Pierce, and when I would try to tell my friends at school my name, they would say, "What, Llama Pierce?"
Oh,
And I just got to the point where I don't want to be so different.
Right.
And so I became more, I don't want to use a distasteful term, but I co-opted more of my father's culture than my mother's for most of my life. And my career as well. I went into a business profession where everything was dark gray suits, hair pulled back in buns, and there was no ruckus behavior. It was just very conservative. And then when I moved to Florida about maybe 13 years ago, I've lost track, everything changed. That subtropical climate just brought all that back from my childhood. And hearing all the different forms of Spanish, the different accents everywhere, I just went straight back to that time and started painting these crazy loud tropical images that you can see here. None of them are quiet. There's not a single neutral tone in anything. It's all Caribbean colors. And even though I've incorporated the desert elements, like you'll see a lot of cactuses, the dusky crow, and creatures that we're accustomed to, they are always in, I don't want to say in conflict, but they're in stasis with all the other elements from my other side, my other culture. So what comes out of it, and I know one of the things that surprises me is that there's always an observer or an outsider. So when you look at these, of course, there's this blue thing that just defies characterization. You have no idea what that is. And that's kind of how I felt. I wouldn't fit into either category. And then, here we've got the quiet Spanish observer in the background. And here, a lot of the cactuses are an attempt to harmonize the two different cultures I grew up with. And they really don't go together. They don't really mix at all. But the fact that I enjoyed putting them together, I thought made an interesting statement. So that's how I started. I just started making a lot of hybrid art, I call it. Bring in a lot of different elements, and it's just a way to process my own identity.
Well, it's great to see how you bring all of it together, and they do go together because it's you.
Oh, yeah.
So you bring it together, so it's fantastic. And now I want to welcome Izel Vargas.
Thank you. So my name is Izel Vargas. I'm originally from South Texas. I grew up on the U.S.-Mexico border, so like 10 minutes from the actual physical river. And so a lot of my work deals with just growing up in that culture and, again, having these binaries, everything being very binary, and just trying to make sense of, what it means to be from there and be able to make work that is engaging and at the same time, able to discuss topics or situations that have, for me, come across once I left the region itself, because now I'm here. And in my travels, living from state to state, from North Carolina to Tennessee to Kentucky to Florida, I've learned that there's also these other borders that exist between people, or these invisible borders, or even sections of towns that are just chopped up. So, and then now that I'm in Florida, I feel like I'm at the crossroads of the old world and the new world, so, or what historically could be known as. And so in itself, it's its own border region, so I found that to be really, really exciting for me in terms of research. But yeah, a lot of my work, it is references to popular culture. A lot of it is just some of my own personal interests, whether it be music, whether it be television or films, or even paranormal. I'm really big into just weird stuff. So that to me is there's a lot of my experience in this, but at the same time, it's also referencing a lot of things that talk about the Latinidad in general for me in the work. So as an instructor, I'm a teacher too. So I've been teaching art now for many years, since 2005 or so, and just being able to talk to kids and get them to understand what I do and maybe how that could relate to them has also been really something that drives me to do my work and keep sort of like someone that people can look to see how they can interpret their own upbringing or their own identity in their work. So my job as an educator also really keeps me going with my work here. But yeah, thank you. I don't know where else I can go with that. Thank you.
Great. So I'm gonna turn these off, and you will do it. So the format that we're gonna have, I have some questions that I prepared, and then at the end I want to invite audience questions from the audience towards the end. So we kind of talk in the next question, which I call it ni de aquí ni de allá, not from here, not from there. I think that you guys talk about this question, but thinking about Hispanic heritage and Latinidad, how has been your identity shaped by heritage, and how has this affected your artistic practice? Have any techniques or tools from your heritage been part of this artistic experimentation or research? So maybe let's start with Missy and go.
Pass. No, just kidding.
Well, you really touch on it, so you want to
No, I'm just teasing. I'm teasing. The tradition that I think that is the most present in my work is the energy and the vibrance of the Latin American influence. That I think has overpowered everything else. Like I said, I don't even use neutrals, so it's all those Caribbean colors and motion and the dynamism.
Okay, well, and I know you mentioned that. How about you, Dana? Do you have any, because you also have these hybrid background.
I identify so much with everything you say. I think there are a lot of ways, but I'm just going to tell you one.
Sure.
And that is the fact that I am an artist at all. This is something that was identified by and nurtured by my mother's side of the family, which is full of artists.
Oh, wow.
Right? These were the first artists I ever met. That was how I knew that you could do that for a living and you could live that way. So the fact that I became an artist is down to my mother's side of the family.
And can you share a little bit about what is her heritage? I believe that's
My mother's Colombian and Peruvian.
All right.
And she is first generation in this country. My grandparents immigrated from Colombia. My grandfather was invited to emigrate. He was the first editor of Selecciones, which is the Reader's Digest.
Yes.
So it was through that he moved to this country.
Wow.
So there are writers, lexicographers, architects, like all of that on my mother's side. So, what was the question again?
No, that's fine. Yeah, so you were very close then with that environment of artists,
absolutely.
Literature.
Yeah, absolutely. It was diametrically opposed to the other side, but it was there.
All right.
It's a wonder we're not insane.
Did you feel, but that ties, like, did you feel a struggle of your own identity? Like, I feel attracted to this cultural environment, but then I'm also part of these.
Well,
I mean, did you feel a struggle?
the
with
big
those?
struggle, one of the big struggles that really confused the issue was there was an anti-Latino voice in my home. That was my father. So when you have that in your home,
Oh, right.
and then you have the other side, and then you don't quite fit anywhere. So I knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation.
And we can
This is
pause.
what it is. This
But
is great.
yeah, this
Yeah.
is, and that's what I like, that name for me, like Nidia King, Nidia, yeah, you know, like. Nidia,
Yeah, no,
not
definitely.
from here,
not from
not
there.
from here,
Definitely,
not
yeah.
from there.
That phrase is something that I, known all my life growing up in that region. Again, it's just that sort of bubble that exists between two very distinct spaces. And you don't recognize it at first being there all your life, just growing up with what you feel is normal. But you cross into Mexico to go visit your, primos or whatever, and then you're just like, oh wow, I feel very American right now, and they'll call you out on it too. You don't,
Right.
no hablas bien. You don't say it right. You're not saying that right. Or ¿por qué no dices Izel, instead of Izel, right? So.
Or why don't you know how to dance?
Right. Oh, yeah. The worst one there.
You were privy
But it's
to a
funny
lot of
too.
our
Like,
conversations.
well, it's funny you said that. Like, my mother was also big on like, you should dance. You should go to when we go to dances or quinceañeras, you need to be dancing. And so it's like you learn how to dance to cumbias, or you learn how to dance to George Strait. Like country music, because it's very big in Texas. So it's just like you got to learn these two different music styles. So I'm just like, nah. Never was for me. So, but then you come to the U.S. I leave Texas. I leave that region.
Wait,
go
is
to
that why I can't dance?
Probably. Maybe it's internal. Like you just don't want to, or the music doesn't do it for you. I mean, I respect both, but I'm not into either one. So, and then you go to North Carolina, where I went for grad school, and where are you from again, bro? Mexico? And I said, oh no, I'm from Texas. They're like, where is that? In Mexico? Like, I was like, no, Texas, man. Like, United States. I'm from the States. And so they're like, oh, I thought you're just Mexican, dude. Like, that's all I see. So I'm like, yeah. So when you're in the U.S., they think you're Mexican. When you're in Mexico, they think you're American. So it's definitely having to straddle that. For me, that's what it's always been. And I carry that with me in a lot of this work, just the way I approach it, the way I make stuff, the way I assemble my images, and and how I keep images like that in my work, or references to my background. They're little fragmented pieces. It might be drawings. It might be in the title. It might be the wording in there. It might be just a play on words. But there's always references to something like that. That in betweenness, if you will, of that living like that for so long. And I'm sure people everywhere I've been feel the same way, and especially Florida. A lot of folks that are born here whose families are from different countries, and then they go home to visit that country and they feel like, I don't fit in here, and then leave Florida, go somewhere in the U.S. and they're like, yeah, where are you from, Colombia? So it's a strange feeling, but it's an in-betweenness that we live in.
And it happens to me, like I left Colombia 20 years ago, and so now the cultural references, the everyday references, now I was born there, but now I'm obviously not well, I'm American on the papers, but I'm not, what is an American, right? And then when I talk with people there, I don't have the idea of the current jokes and the current states and the cultural there. So I'm like, okay, I am also part of that in between. And so I think for me that was so interesting putting this show together, because thinking about Hispanic or Latinos, like all the shows and all I've done it by theme. And so for me to think, okay, I need to pull together, and I lived in Mexico, I lived in New York, I lived in Houston, and so for a reason, I never look for the Latino community or the Hispanic community. I will look for the arts. Where are the artists? And so it's like, okay, the weirdos, the artists, the musicians. That was my clique. When I came back to home, because my family lives here, it's like, okay, I'm connecting more to the community that is Hispanic or Colombians. But I will always, every time I move, it's like, where's the nearest gallery? I need the nearest opening. So even as a transplant,
Yeah.
I feel like I lost a lot of my current Colombian identity.
Yeah.
So kind of talking about loss, I'm curious about traditions. So some traditions tend to get diluted with time and generations. Are there any traditions that you keep or that come from your family that are still present in your life or art making? Or have you discarded by choice any traditions that have come from your family?
Oh, definitely. The art world, it's more from my maternal side, traditions, the vibrancy, the flamboyance, the motion. What I have rejected are, as I've said before, the neutrals, the symmetry. I don't like symmetry at all in my work.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's about it.
Okay, great. How about you, Dana? Traditions?
I think in my work that I really reject the idea that it is one culture or the other.
Mm-hmm.
I bring them together, and bringing them together is what is me, the hybrid, right? So I think that grows stronger with time, and a tradition really on my mother's side is so much about family and spending time together, and as I get older, that grows stronger.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I have breakfast with my mother, I have dinner with my mother. Do you know what I mean? Like, these things grow stronger. So that I find that that real one-on-one family time, not watching television, having
Mm-hmm.
conversations, comes from that side of the family.
That's great. That's great. Yes. Izel?
I think for me, a lot of it, I don't know if I consciously do anything in the art that I would say it's like referencing, or I should say that I've kept from my family. If anything, I do a lot of rejecting, or just kind of just playing against it. I think that in my life, though, things like food, especially how I make certain things, or using the way my abuelita used to make whatever carne picada or whatever, or even things like I recently started collecting records, vinyl records again, and my mother, that was her thing. That's what she used to do when we were kids.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's nostalgic, and it's also just kind of, I felt like when I started doing it, kind of carrying on what she did, But as far as the art goes, I think I'm kind of on board where Dana's at. I don't really think of it that way. What you see in the work is my experience or my point of view, and it's not referencing one in particular thing, or I think I do recycle a lot of imagery, but I try not to make that the focus. And especially and you've seen it, if you've lived in Texas, you're probably familiar with a lot of Latino art, Chicano art from there, and I've had this conversation with Joseph as well, and as far as the tropes and the overusage of certain imagery in that kind of art style, and so I try and actively work against it, or remix it, or try and do something new with it, just to give it some kind of new life. So I think a lot of my practice is just resisting a lot of tradition. So I try and just make something new from that. So I hope that makes sense.
It does, especially the part about resisting the tropes.
Yeah.
Because I'll be painting something, and all of a sudden there's this very domineering, bossy female figure.
Sure.
It's like, whoa, where did that come from?
Yeah.
So yes, I'm always trying to tamp that down as well.
Great. So because this is a conversation, I think that you talked already. What I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna direct questions to each one of you, but you can jump in if you wanna contribute. So I think that you kind of answered some of it, but if you want to expand, because I moved. When I was in Mexico, and I was the other because I was not, I was a Colombiana. And then when I moved to Houston, when you're in South America, you learn different American history, not the whole history, because why are we going to learn that? So when I was in Houston, I was meeting people that have been living there for generations before. I mean, when it was Mexico, and I was like, what do you mean? Like, it's like my family never moved. We were Mexicans, now we're Americans, but we have always lived in the same town. And so that incredible sense of pride, because I have moved here to South Florida, when all of us are moving and we come from different places and then we go to different places, but this sense of pride and belonging that I experienced in Houston and in Texas from the people that have been living there is very, very strong. So I know you touch on this a little bit already, but how does it feel like you moved to North Carolina, you moved to South Florida? Do you look for that community and do you find it in the arts community? How does that go?
No, definitely. I mean, for me, a lot of my, and I call it research, but and Sharon understands it, my wife, because she's a photography professor, so she understands documentation, understands process, understands researching your materials. And so we would, before my daughter was born, we would go out, like 2, 3 in the morning. Hey, let's go shoot photos. Okay, and then we just go wherever. And whether it be in Tennessee or in Kentucky or in North Carolina, we just go. But now we can't. My little daughter is asleep. We're like, yeah, right. We're done with that. But I would actively go out and look for these, little areas, little pockets of Latinidad or spaces of familiarity, places that spoke the language or had the food. North Carolina had several little pockets, and there was even a town called Siler City that was predominantly Latino or Mexican, because there was a huge influx of immigrants that were working in the tobacco fields. So there was this entire town, you drive in, you're just like panaderias, and you're like, oh, whoa, what's going on here in North Carolina? And so that was shocking to me, and I was just like, wow, let me go here and shoot photographs and just talk to folks. Kentucky, same thing. There's a huge population of people from Aguascalientes, and everything is, panaderia Aguascalientes or whatever, but they're all from, and I guess somebody moved there one time and they said, we're all coming here, and everybody started moving there, so it was just a population of folks from Aguascalientes in Kentucky. So seeing that and understanding that, yeah, there's these little spaces of familiarity that I can, speak the language or hear the familiar music, and that made me feel a little bit more comfortable in a place that was not like me, So I actively would search for that, And then coming to Florida, I knew right away when Sharon said we're going to Florida from Kentucky. I was like, oh wow, so this is going to be the big one. Everybody's there, and because you're looking at Colombians, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, especially, the big one, Brazilians, which was, to me shocking. I did not know there was this many Brazilians here, and then that the Portuguese is not the Spanish, and so people thought. I worked for a hotel when I first started here, and they thought one of the guys at the front desk, he's like, hey, you speak Spanish, right? I said, yeah. Come talk to these people over here, I don't know what they're saying. And I go over there and they're speaking in Portuguese, and I was like, hey, this is Portuguese, dude, I don't know what they're saying. I don't know what they're saying. He's like, who speaks Portuguese then? I was like, So we had to figure something out for that. But I definitely, language is a big part of that, So for me, I definitely feel like I do actively, look for these places to feel something familiar, and that makes me feel more comfortable in my area, And as a father, it's hard too, because my daughter, she's growing up with this English language, and that's all she knows, and I don't have very many opportunities to speak to her. She does know the alphabet her numbers in Spanish right now, which is great. But I would like for her to keep going with that. But I'm not a big proponent on you have to speak Spanish. I've never been that, and that's always what it's been since I was growing up. And my abuelos have already all passed on, and they were the ones that I would communicate with in Spanish predominantly. But I haven't had that in a long time now.
So I'm curious, because you mentioned Sharon. I know she's a photographer. She teaches. Has she share with you, because what you mentioned is like she said 3 a.m. was going to take some pictures. So has she embraced this and made it part also of the culture? Because in a way she's Latino by marriage, right? So she's always been, when I first met her too, one of the cool things is she knew a lot about,
culture. And so I was like, okay, cool. And I think it's like some music she would listen to that we had in common too. We're like, oh, okay, you know that band? Oh. And so we had that, going when we first met. And she's a vegan, so it's not easy to make, Mexican food with her because I can't be making like carne picada or anything like that, or fajitas at home. Yeah, right. That's meat. That's the hard part, is getting her to get on board with that. And Ivy's also a vegetarian, so she doesn't eat any meat. So there's parts that she definitely embraced, but there's a lot of things that she doesn't, like that one especially. But we also did, before she was born, we did the ancestry. To see, for my daughter, to let her see, like, look, this is all we are here. And I was baffled by all the things that she was. But mine was just mostly Spain and indigenous to America here. And little spots of Britain, and I'm like, wow, look at that, I'm 2% British, that's awesome.
You're alone.
So it was funny though. She accepts what she can. I guess you could say, I don't know how to expand on that. But yeah, I think the veganism is really hard on us.
So you touched something that I'm gonna address to Dana, because in one of our long email conversations we talk about Latino, and then that's being defined by geography, right? And then we talk about Hispanic, and then it's because we are tied by language. And so one of your emails, there was a question, and it's just like, well, how is a Hispanic person defined by knowing a language? So do you want to talk a little bit about, do you want to expand on that?
Sure. I think with my background, it's always been difficult for me to pin down, like, even the question like about your Hispanic heritage. I'm like, well, what exactly is that? Mm-hmm. It's always been a question mark, because there have been, my Hispanic roots were really suppressed growing up. So that sort of asymmetry kind of sent that a little into hibernation, and when I work through some of these issues in my art and I talk about them, I'm like, well, what is that even? And I find myself, for whatever reason, left out of a lot of conversations about this. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the primary reasons that might be is because of language. And I think there isn't a lot of language justice that's about. It's either one language is dominating or the other. When I had my studio in Miami, mm-hmm. Spanish was dominant. Mm-hmm. It just really, like, what does it mean? Is it language? I don't think so.
Right.
I understand people think in their language, but and when I mention language justice, I mean that people are able to express themselves in the language in which they are most comfortable doing so. Mm-hmm. And to have tools available so that we can understand each other. I think we're a long way away from that. Yeah. But so I think, well, what is culture? What is it that makes me Hispanic? Is it my mother's blood? Is it our customs? Our experiences? It gets a little muddled about right. what that actually means. And where I come from, it was even more muddled, and really just these cross currents that were incompatible. So I don't actually have a full understanding of what it means, but I know we are.
Right. And it's very interesting, because when we look at this identity, then it's like, well, if we're talking about language, so what happens with the tribes that are still active and they're producing amazing culturals? There's a lot of tribes in the Amazons with artists that they're going to school and they're doing this thing. So are they Hispanic? They don't speak the language, but so the conversation, like, once we start with technicalities of what mm-hmm. we are, who are we excluding, who are we including? So I like that conversation, this back and forth that we had, because there's no real answer. I don't think anybody has the answer, but it's like what makes us comfortable and the identity that we take, no? And I'm just gonna drop the name, but I'm not gonna drop in there. But recently, a person from my younger generation referred to me as Latinx, and I was like, I think I'm Latinx also, and I don't know. So now that digs into, I know it's with gender.
Oh, do you know what's funny about that is the constant rebranding, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I had a conversation with my mother. We watched the news every morning, right? And we had this conversation a few years ago. She said, "Who are the brown people?" And I was like, "You, Maria Luz, you are the brown people." She had been rebranded.
Right.
With that sort of unwitting, and she was like, "Oh," she never thought of herself that way, and now it's in sort of the mainstream conversation.
Right.
And she's like, no, I'm not brown. She rejects it because it's, who wants to be rebranded? And it's just like a weird thing that these definitions keep shifting.
Yep.
And even her name, Maria Luz, right? She was born with that name. She gave my sister that name. But yet everyone says Mary Lou. Because that's just easier for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1960, Maria Luz became Mary Lou. And it's just easy.
Right.
That gets into misogyny, that gets into a lot of other things.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
but
So
it just...
We'll do another seminar.
Yeah, but it's how you slowly, like there's a little erasure,
Yeah.
a little more erasure, and then what the fuck do you have? Sorry.
Is your mother really light skinned, Dana? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
very
there's also
light-skinned.
the
You
skin,
wouldn't know
the
she
skin
was
politics of
Hispanic
that.
until she started going,
Oh yeah. No,
right?
no.
You wouldn't even know.
There's also the skin politics involved with that because there's always been that
Yeah, the
in
color.
Latino culture, right?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, I have a
and-
slight yellow hue, so you can tell.
And I was known as El Güero, like they call me the lighter one. And my mother was La Negra, right? Because she was really dark.
Right.
And you look at my grandparents, my grandmother Enriqueta, very light skinned, very almost pale, and my grandfather's very dark skinned. So we're all still, we all have parts of this to this day. My little brother is really morenito, he's really dark, and so that's always been a thing, in the culture, and there's a lot of classism involved in that too. So that's for her to say like that. It's almost like she rejected or she accepted that as her. That's her reality, and so.
And we have these conversations now, and she thinks I make too much of it because
No,
she's
yeah.
accepted it. It's
Yeah.
been for her for so long that me pointing it out to her is not perhaps the best thing to do. But I'm interested in having that conversation with her.
That's good.
At the age of 88, tell me.
Oh, wow.
Let's talk about this. I want to know how this happened. I want to know how you feel about it.
Right.
So it's really, and when I go to Colombia and we see my mom's family, they can't say my name. They say Donna. They can't say Dan. They can't say Dana. They say Donna or Dana.
Right.
And I'm too tall to be one of them.
Right. Yeah.
So they're all little people.
Right.
Anyway.
No. Well, but I mean,
Yeah.
I'm so happy and glad to be able to have this conversation. Safe environment, and then surrounded by art. Art is inviting us to have this conversation. So, Missy, this last question that I have, I think that we also touched on these. In past conversations, we discussed how your art displayed the imagery of the desert with the Colombian Caribbean as a reflection of the culture that you observed growing up. As your art evolves, is this something that happens consciously or something that you come to find out as you look at the paintings? Is there anything that has surprised you of your artwork moments, days? Oh, okay, hold on. Is there anything that has surprised you of your artwork, either moments, days, or some time as you have created it? So basically, when you do your art, these mix of cultures, do they come consciously, or is it like after you paint it and then you come and see the painting and like, oh, there it is, my cultures?
Well, it's a little of both. I think because I am attached to the idea of hybrid, like a combination of different things. That is more intentional in my work. I will never have a bird without butterfly wings, or some creature that is unidentifiable will be in there. So I would say it's probably more intentional. What surprises me though is the emotions that come out of the work. It's like, oh, what's going on over here? There's maybe a hostile observer in this one, or a judgmental one, or a loving one. The emotions are surprising, but the hybridity is all that's intentional.
Do you feel, when people are looking at your artwork, and do you hear what they're saying, and does the comments identify? Have you heard people saying things about your work that surprised you? I was like, oh, I didn't see that happening, or like, oh, yes, that makes sense. I did that because of that.
Yeah, sometimes it's nice. I like to hear other people's interpretations.
That's great. That's great.
Missy,
Any other thoughts?
do your figures look out at the people, or are they?
Sometimes.
Okay, yeah.
Sometimes.
And I wanted to ask you, is that something that you want to have? You know, you have your viewer who's looking at the work, but then you have something looking back at, or a person looking back at them, or is the intention for them to be, or the figure that you have to be looking at what's happening in the space of the work?
I think it's mostly the figure is an outsider looking into the work. If that answers.
Just I'm just curious because I remember, I think it was Francis Bacon who would put glass over his work, so he would have the audience reflect and see themselves in the work. And I remember like, wow, that's so powerful. Like I never thought about that, having them to, like suddenly there's, I don't know, an animal carcass and then their head is right there silhouetted against it. What that could bring about in the viewer. That's why I was asking. I just wanted to know if you had that.
Yeah, because I paint a lot of animal carcasses.
There you go. Cool. Down with that. That's cool.
Great. So I think we can open it to the public, and you can tell me how we're doing in time.
Yeah, we're doing good. So we have 15 more minutes if people
15
want to ask some questions. I want to follow up with Dina about the pieces where you said there were individual items that you said were references, and one of them was a spoon. What were the things that you were talking about that you were
So a lot of the objects that are, I'm going to say my Hispanic objects, these were things that were in our childhood home. That spoon hung on the wall of our home forever. Quite often I saw these really sort of hyper stereotypical objects in our home. They might be little Spanish dancers on a shelf, or a spoon hanging, like, it was seeing these cultural references sort of sitting on a shelf, as it were, not in real life. And so I use these objects in the work now as just with other objects from the home as well, just as a way to have a conversation about that fragments of identity. Does that answer it? Yeah.
So contrasting the two halves of your identity and just using those as like the reference point of, okay, this is what I remember. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you also talk about, one of the other things that you talk about like a lot in the painting is the highlights. And that was the Highlights magazines at your dad's office or something. So like that's a sort of a contrast, right? You have that side of your life as well.
Absolutely. That work is more heavy on that side. Highlights magazine was something that at the time that I was growing up, the actual company that had Highlights magazine was failing, and as a way to bump up the business, they decided to get that magazine into doctors' and dentists' offices for free so they could get more of a readership, which intersected with my life of weekends cleaning my father's office. And I spent a lot of time with that publication. That was quite often my only free time, right? So
I had it at church in the house.
we got it for free. So those kind of influences are kind of, amusing to me, and amusing for me has like a little surprise element to it that I see that reflected back at me. And that's what happens in the paintings quite often. And I think it happens a little bit in some of the maximalist qualities that are happening in the dioramas, sort of things here, there, everywhere, without spelling out a clear linear narrative.
Any other questions or comments?
I have a question for Dana.
Uh-oh.
And you can refuse to answer it, and that's absolutely fine with me.
Mhm.
How did your parents meet? Just out of curiosity.
My mother was filling a prescription for her father in a pharmacy where my father was the pharmacist.
Okay. Thank you. All right.
Any other questions?
I have a
Yes.
question. And I'm a friend of Missy, but I'm just curious, in these times, there's such touchy subjects of cultural appropriation. And I would think I'm from San Diego, so I understand a lot of what you grew up in the environment in Texas. My grandmother is from Guatemala, but I don't identify myself as Hispanic at all. But I have a lot of the culture of the Chicano culture. I grew up with that. Do you struggle, do you struggle with finding that hybrid identity that you maybe have to fight, that you don't have a right to some of those cultural, some of the cultural identities because you didn't have it in your home? I'm just wondering internally, I would think for me, that would be tough. I struggle with it using things in art, like Missy knows I love the Lotteria cards, I love all that. I have to think, should I be using these? These aren't my culture. I'm just wondering if you ever experience anything like that.
Well, if you're asking me, absolutely, all the time. I check myself, and I have been called out on it before too. And I have a very Caucasian surname, and so it opens different doors. So yes, I'm very, very concerned about that in my work.
Really? And I find that so sad.
Yeah.
It is sad.
I find that so sad.
I've been called out on it too. I've been called out on it in a painting series with figures that are dancing, like they're very obviously Latin, and I've been called out on it.
So how Latin is Latin?
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right, and even the use of some objects, I've been called out on it, and I call bullshit, right? I have full right to,
Absolutely.
and I don't need to qualify because I don't visually appear to be someone who should use those things.
Right.
Right, so that's like
So
another.
there's another struggle in
Yeah.
in your
It goes
in your
on
identity
and on.
and your,
Yeah.
yeah.
How about you? You wouldn't
Have
get called
I-
out. Who would call
No,
you out?
but,
No.
no, you're right. No, but I mean, this has come up in conversations with students.
Right.
This has come up in conversations with other artists that I've known that, they're Hispanic, but they have a white last name or an American last name. Brian, my buddy Brian in Texas, Brian Wedgworth, huge sculpture artist. No one knew that his mother was Hispanic, but, or Latino, or there's a bunch of words we can go into with that. Yeah, but no, that is something that has come up often, and it's a real thing. How you approach it, I think that when I talk to students about it, I always say, look, you need to know what you're doing because someone's going to question you. Someone's going to be ready to talk about this. Research this. Why is black hair important? And, you're Jewish, young Jewish girl. You want to do this in this image, but understand what the history is. Understand why you're doing it. Someone's going to ask you, what are you doing with this? And if you just say, well, I like the hair, that's not an answer. That's no answer. You need to research this. This is going to take work. This is going to take understanding. This is going to take understanding that viewpoint. What is the history of what is powerful about it? How is this a point of identity for somebody? And not just something, pretty or, something that you want to do because you want to do it. Understand what it's about first. Do some legwork is what I would tell her. You're gonna have to do that research because someone's gonna ask you one day. So be ready for it.
But do you think that's fair that people ask about it?
I think so, definitely. Yeah. I think so.
But so say, you're talking like Missy talked about her two different sides of her family and that living in two different cultures. And even if you know, maybe your family, there's probably examples of people who don't come from that country, but you know, maybe they spent years growing up there, and they did speak the language or they didn't speak the language. And there's situations where, like you're talking about, just because you don't speak the language, does that not mean that you can't absorb
Right.
any of the culture?
My name is one of those situations right there, Izel.
Yeah.
And my family, my mother, you know, and father came up with that name. It was just like this play on letters by some football player back in the 70s.
Oh,
or the
really?
80s, yeah. If anybody watched football then, I know the whole story, I can tell you, but we're not gonna get into that. Isaiah Moses Hip played for the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And my dad was like a big fan, and he's like, we're gonna name him Izel Moses Vargas, that's gonna be his name. And little did they know, Izel is a girl's name in Mexico.
Oh.
So my whole life it's been like that Johnny Cash song, Boy Named Sue. So yeah, I've been fighting with people my whole life because they knew that it's a girl's name. Why would you be? Well, it's Izel, really. And they're like, you're not saying it right though, you know. And so back and forth all the time.
Right.
And then when I got to Florida, I just said, finally, you know what? If they're gonna say you said, they say you said. I talked to you about this.
Right.
And they're correct, because that's how you would say it in Spanish. But I usually just say it's Izel Vargas, yeah. But yeah, it always comes up. You're not saying it right. What's up with that? You know, so.
And I would think that with your daughter, even, okay, so she may learn more Spanish, she may not, but you want her, if you're the person who's going and looking for towns to, you know, feel a sense of home and stuff, you're probably going to impart some of that to her along the way. So you want her to absorb some portion of that. And she may or may not know the language, but she will have some version. So to me, and what you've done in this exhibition, I think is show that hybridity, the diversity of culture in the United States, and included so many different people. We have Portuguese artists, we have artists
In Spain.
Yeah, we have artists from all over the place. And that was the point, is show the diversity and show what everybody absorbs from their cultures, which I think is just showing you, the three of you talking about it. It's so clear. And frustrating.
Yeah.
Because you had to deal with so much.
Yeah.
And
You know, it
still
was frustrating living in London for 12 years and realizing my English wasn't so good.
Not proper, right?
Because they speak a different dialect,
do. Right.
right? So there was that. That was
Right.
interesting.
You just don't fit in anywhere.
No.
But in this, it's like, and I go back to that point, like, at some point I wasn't even looking for the ethnicity that I fit in, but it's like, where's the artist?
That's what
Where's the
when I
arts
was in
crowd?
London.
And then
Find the
belong.
artist.
I belong. And so what
Yeah.
I see with the artworks here, like, going back to your question, just to give you my opinion, is people won't question the artwork. They may question the creator, but the
Yeah,
artwork,
they don't.
but then
That's a
it's
good distinction.
transpiring. It's transpiring what, you know, you see the desert, you see the spoon, you see the crazy creatures are there. So when someone questions, because I remember I overheard when we were doing the drop-off, someone asked like, but is she Hispanic? It's like, she considers herself Hispanic or Latino. That's all, and the artwork certainly has elements. That's it, you know. But even, you know, as closer to home, I overheard and I was like, okay, it's spicy. I don't know who it was. I don't know who they're referring to, but the artwork, I don't know, maybe me, you know. So yeah, I think as long as the artwork reflects and is not what you were saying about the respect. If someone is interested about a culture and they approach it with the respect, with the proper research, why not? I've met in the doctorate PhD world, there's people doing research on cultures and I mean, you name it, and they may not be from that culture, but that interest comes from a sense of deep curiosity and interest and respect and wanting to know more. So why not, you know? Great.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you to our